Tomorrow is Memorial Day, an annual holiday for mourning members of the U.S. military who died in active service. And with only a fragile ceasefire separating us from renewed war with Iran, this Memorial Day weekend feels like an important time to pause and reflect. Because one of the ways we best honor those who serve is by insisting that military force be treated as a last resort, never entered into casually, recklessly, or without deep moral discernment. To support our troops means not only honoring their courage and sacrifice, but also caring about what burdens are we asking them to carry? What wars are we sending them to fight? And the countless lives forever altered or lost whenever diplomacy fails and violence begins. Some of you here today have served in the military. Others, like me, carry the stories, the wounds, the losses, the complicated legacies of family members and friends who have served. Memorial Day is not abstract. It lives on in real people, in real grief. I find myself grieving not only the lives already lost in our latest war, but also how quickly war can be normalized in public life. And despite all the positive spin that the Trump administration has tried to put on the Iran war, we need to be honest about the reality. Wars are never quick, clean, or cost-free. Thousands of people have already been killed across the region, including civilians, and tens of thousands more have been wounded. American troops have been killed and injured. Independent analysts estimate a financial cost of around $72 billion so far. Meanwhile, satellite imagery suggests that damage to U.S. military structures in the region has been far more extensive than has been publicly acknowledged. Behind every sanitized press conference or triumphant headline lives a deeper truth. That war leaves behind graves and grief, destruction and debt, wounds that ripple outward for generations. And despite all the money spent, all the lives already lost, and all the destruction already unleashed, recent U.S. intelligence assessments indicate that Iran still retains substantial military capacities, including much of its missile and drone arsenal, operational access to most of its missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, even after months of warfare, tens of billions of dollars spent, the conflict remains far from resolved, which is one more reminder that wars are much easier to begin than to end. Even more disturbing is the Christian nationalist rhetoric that has increasingly surrounded this war. Throughout history, one of the greatest temptations of nations has been to cloak war in this language of divine will, to cast military conflict as a holy struggle between one's own side as pure and righteous, and the other side as evil and deserving of punishment. And in recent months, Christian nationalist language, including from some of the highest echelons of power, has echoed that dangerous tradition, invoking themes that sound less like democracy soberly wrestling with war and more like the spirit of the Crusades. But when religion becomes a tool for sanctifying violence, spirituality is distorted. The role of a spiritually mature religion is not to bless endless war. It is to call all of us on all sides back to humility, conscience, compassion, and peace. In that spirit, leaders within our own Unitarian Universalist Association have publicly rejected the Christian nationalist theology that has been used to justify this war with Iran. They have reminded us that peace is not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of dignity, accountability, compassion, and pluralism. Our UU values teach that no nation, religion, or people possess a monopoly on human worth or divine truth. And when governments attempt to sanctify military domination, we, people of conscience, have the right and responsibility to resist that domination. The power of relationship, solidarity, diplomacy, cooperation, and truth. And when wars are waged amid so many moral and legal and spiritual questions, we must also remember the profound burden placed upon those who are ordered to fight them. Reports in recent months have described a growing crisis of conscience among some troops and veterans and military officers, including fears about being ordered to participate in actions that may violate international law or basic human morality. Military service members are not machines. They are human beings with consciences, families, moral convictions, and inner lives. And one of the deepest tragedies of war is that it can force ordinary people into impossible situations in which obedience collides with the demands of conscience. Honoring our troops means caring not only for their physical safety, but also for their moral and their spiritual well-being. And if all of that were not troubling enough, there have also been deeply alarming reports of senior military leaders and officials being pushed out or sidelined amid demands for greater ideological loyalty. Experienced military officers who have raised concerns, defended institutional norms, or emphasized legal and constitutional constraints, you can't do these things legally, have increasingly found themselves marginalized or removed. At the very moment when moral clarity, professional integrity, and independent judgment are most needed, there are growing fears that conscience and expertise are being treated as liabilities instead of strengths. This combination of ideological purges alongside weakened institutional safeguards should alarm all of us who care about democracy, the rule of law, and the ethical use of military power. And even after all the death and destruction and staggering expense already incurred, the response from many political leaders and defense contractors has not been restraint, diplomacy, or reflection. Instead, the message has increasingly been spend more, expand more, escalate further. In fact, the current administration is now proposing roughly $1.5 trillion in military spending in the next year alone, a staggering increase of approximately 40% that would push Pentagon spending to the highest level in modern American history. But our country already spends more on the military than the next several countries combined. And yet we are now being told that still greater military budgets are urgently needed. Meanwhile, our schools are struggling. Medical debt is crushing families. Communities across this country lack adequate medical care, child care, addiction treatment, and support for veterans returning home from war. One of the deepest moral questions any society must ask is not merely what we are willing to fund, but what we are unwilling to fund because so much has already been consumed by militarism. In his farewell address more than 60 years ago, President Dwight Eisenhower warned our nation about the growing power of what he called the military-industrial complex. By this, he meant this dangerous entanglement of the military establishment and the private arms industry in ways that would encourage a constant expansion of military spending and war-making power regardless of the public good or the nation's actual security needs, what actually keeps us safe. Today, Eisenhower's warning feels like prophecy fulfilled. That is why people of conscience must continue insisting that human life matters more than profit margins, political power, or imperial ambition. And history shows that when nations repeatedly pursue domination through military force, the consequences often echo for generations in ways that leaders fail to foresee in advance, the law of unintended consequences. And although we do not have time today to explore all of the history involved, I would be remiss if I did not name at least one of the profound ironies underlying this conflict. Our own country, the United States, helped lay some of the groundwork for this hostility that we are confronting. In 1953, the United States and the United Kingdom supported a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister and strengthened the authoritarian rule of the Shah. That intervention helped fuel decades of resentment, instability, and anti-American backlash that continue reverberating to this day. And history also warns us how easily these patterns of intervention and escalation can repeat themselves. And now there are growing fears of further military escalation toward Cuba. I've been to Cuba twice. Who's been to Cuba? Okay, I see a few hands. I've been twice. I spent a week there in 2004 and again in 2005. I care deeply about I can only use the word immiserated lives of the ordinary Cuban people, some of whom I have known as friends for decades. The Cuban people deserve freedom, dignity, economic opportunity, and the chance to shape their own future. But after witnessing decades of failed interventions, sanctions, and coups around the world, I do not trust militarized regime change to bring the justice, stability, or genuine flourishing that ordinary Cuban people deserve. If we are serious about peace, moral honesty requires acknowledging that nations, including our own, sometimes help create the very crises that we later claim, only war can solve this. And that kind of moral self-reflection can be uncomfortable. One writer recently posed a provocative but vital moral question. What if we, the United States, held up a mirror and tried to see ourselves as other nations sometimes see us? How would we react if another powerful country claimed the right to bomb the United States preemptively because we were viewed as dangerous, destabilizing, insufficiently democratic, and in violation of international norms? We are all of those things. Most Americans would immediately recognize that logic as outrageous, intolerable. And yet part of the danger of nationalism and empire is their ability to slowly persuade people that the rules meant to govern everyone else somehow don't apply to us. As one bumper sticker puts it, I love my country, but I think we should start seeing other people. Patriotic love at its best includes a capacity for self-reflection, moral consistency, and humility. The willingness to ask not only what we fear others might do, but also how our own actions appear in the eyes of the world. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to step back and look at the larger patterns that have been unfolding for decades: escalating military budgets, endless foreign intervention, and the growing influence of defense contractors and the gradual normalization of permanent war. If you're curious to learn more, one book I found helpful while researching this sermon is The $1 Trillion War Machine: How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us Here at Home. It's by William Hartung and Ben Freeman. Hartung is an expert on the arms industry and military spending. Freeman studies foreign policy and national security. This book was published just a few months before the Iran war began. That means that the warning signs and systemic problems they describe were already present before the latest conflict and feel even more urgent today. One of the paradoxes of modern American militarism is that we continue spending more and more money on the military while often feeling less and less secure. Adjusted for inflation, the United States now spends significantly more on the military than we did at the height of the Cold War. And even though our armed forces are substantially smaller than they once were, at the same time, more than half of Pentagon spending, more than half, does not flow to the troops. It goes to private contractors and to defense corporations. The result is a system in which these enormous profits flow to weapons manufacturers, even while military families and veterans continue to struggle. This is deeply, deeply perverse. And the financial scale of all of this is almost difficult to comprehend. The post-9/11 wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond ultimately cost the United States roughly $8 trillion. That figure does not include the cost of the latest war in Iran. Hartung and Freeman also challenged us to think not only about how much money war costs, but about what else that money could have made possible. Every year, our country spends more on the Pentagon than it does on numerous other major domestic departments combined, more than education, labor, commerce, justice, diplomacy, veteran affairs, and homeland security combined. All of those. That same $8 trillion could have funded enormous investments in renewable energy, dramatically accelerated efforts to combat climate change, erased all student debt, expanded healthcare, strengthened infrastructure, reduced poverty, and transformed countless lives here at home. In other words, militarism not only shapes foreign policy, but also what kind of society we become and what kind of society we fail to become. Over decades, we have allowed a political culture to take hold in which endless military expansion is treated as normal, while investments in education, housing, healthcare, environmental sustainability, and human flourishing are constantly described as unrealistic and unaffordable. One of the deepest spiritual dangers of militarism is not only the violence that it unleashes abroad, but the ways it is narrowing our collective imagination about what is possible right here at home, how we might achieve our own country. Society shaped by militarism can slowly forget how to imagine a future, rooted in anything other than fear, dominance, and competition. We begin accepting scarcity as inevitable while treating endless preparation for war as merely realistic. But more than 70 years ago, President Eisenhower saw this danger coming long before most of us were willing to name it. In a prescient 1953 speech titled "A Chance for Peace," he warned that every escalation in military spending carries hidden moral costs. He said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, in the final sense, is a theft. A theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. The world in arms, he said, is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, whose wisdom and intelligence should be directed elsewhere. It is spending the hopes of its children. So where do we go from here? Hartung and Freeman argue that the answer cannot simply be always more war, more weapons, more military spending. Instead, they call for a different vision of security, one rooted less in domination and fear and more in diplomacy, cooperation, accountability, and human flourishing. True security requires investing in the conditions that allow people and societies to thrive: healthcare, education, infrastructure, climate resilience, stable democracies, and the peaceful resolution of conflict before violence spirals out of control. How many of you have seen the musical Rent? This many years ago now, but there's that many lines from that film, from that play. But one that's always stuck with me is that the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is creation, because war is so destructive. The opposite of war is creating something better and new and different. These authors also challenge the deeply ingrained assumption that military superiority alone can create lasting peace. Again and again, military intervention has claimed to solve one crisis while actually creating new crises in its wake. And so the deeper challenge before us is not merely changing a few policies, but changing our imagination. Moving away from the assumption that endless preparation for war is normal and inevitable, and toward a world that takes diplomacy, peacemaking, mutual accountability, and our shared humanity seriously. And let me be clear, the peace we seek, I'm not talking about naivete. Peace is not pretending that danger doesn't exist in the world. Peace is the difficult and disciplined work of building the relationships, the institutions, the treaties, the international norms that make violence less likely before it begins. History reminds us that diplomacy has prevented nuclear escalation. It has helped reduce nuclear stockpiles and helped former enemies become lasting allies. War may sometimes become unavoidable, but a culture organized around permanent preparation for war as our highest priority is very different from a culture genuinely committed to peace. Building that kind of culture will not be easy, but endless war is not easy either. And only one of these paths offer any real hope for a more peaceful future. I want to move toward my conclusion with some profound insights from a recent essay by the activist Rebecca Solnit. It's from her ongoing blog, Meditations in an Emergency. I recommend it to you for such a time as this. This particular essay is titled, Flowers Bloom on Soldiers' Graves, Lessons in Power and Consequences. She warns us that too often nations confuse violence with strength. Missiles look powerful, they are powerful. Armies look powerful. Threats and domination look powerful. Yet violence repeatedly proves incapable of creating the very thing that we human beings need most: trust, belonging, safety, relationships, lasting peace. There's another kind of power rooted not in coercion, but in relationship, the power of cooperation, solidarity, diplomacy, compassion, mutual care. Violence can destroy, but only connection can truly sustain the lives that we long for. Inspired by both springtime blossoming out the window and the botanist David Haskell's book, How Flowers Made Our World, the story of nature's revolutionaries, Solnit reflects that flowers transform the world not only through domination, but through relationship, through forms of cooperation and interdependence that allowed them to flourish. I'll feed you, they say. I'll feed you fruit if you scatter my seeds. Human societies, we face a similar choice. We can continue building a world rooted primarily in fear, militarism, nationalism, and domination, or we can invest more deeply in the fragile, difficult, but much more life-giving work of relationship, diplomacy, justice, compassion, and peace. As our UU value of interdependence reminds us, our lives are bound together, whether we acknowledge it or not. Our suffering is connected. Our flourishing is connected. Our future is connected. But when we dehumanize others, pursue endless war, glorify violence, we ultimately wound not only others, but ourselves. Memorial Day calls us not merely to mourn the dead. We must do that as well. But it also calls us to ask, what kind of world might we build that might leave fewer graves needing flowers in the future? May we build such a world. I'll give you one more kind of touchstone for this Memorial Day weekend that I often think about for if we ever really wanted to build this beloved community that we talk about. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used to talk about there are three triple threats, he said, that continually hold us back the most from actually building the beloved community. Now, he's most associated with racism, one of those triple threats. But he said the other two equally important, it's racism, classism, and militarism. That those are the three things that hold us back, that racism keeping us apart, classism, again, keeping us apart, but then also militarism, spending all of these trillions of dollars instead of building the society here at home that we need. And I think, of course, if King were alive today, he would add a fourth of ecological consciousness and climate change, because keep in mind, when King was killed in April of '68, that was before the first Earth Day. So that wasn't quite on his radar, but it very much would have been. So as we continue into the rest of this day and the weekend and week to come, may you continue your journey with all of this stuff that's so hard to control. Continue to control what you can. Continue your journey with love at the center. Care for one another. Care for this one earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of even just a little more hope or love or peace or joy, that goes with you out into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. And even in this very hard time, continue to look for and savor all that still remains good and true and beautiful. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.